Hello everyone, my name is Dalton Jenkins and I'm going to be giving a lecture I've prepared on chapter 49 of our textbook titled Nervous Systems. I also want to apologize in advance for any sniffling and if my voice sounds strange. I've been under the weather. Moving right along. We'll start by talking about nervous system composition, and first I want to define a couple terms, the first of which is nerves. Nerves are structures that make up the nervous systems of the body, and they are formed by grouping or bundling of the axons of several neurons. Additionally, nerves facilitate the flow of information in the nervous systems. So what are nervous systems? The nervous system is an organ system present in animals that sends electrical signals via neurons throughout the body to facilitate the coordination and control of certain bodily functions. Additionally, the nervous systems can be separated into the central nervous system, which is comprised of neurons that facilitate integration, and the peripheral nervous system, which is comprised of neurons that deliver information to and from the central nervous system from the rest of the body. Finally, ganglia. Ganglia are structures found within the nervous systems of animals that possess them and are comprised of groups of neurons that are segmentally arranged and facilitate the transfer of information by acting as relay points. So next I want to talk about the organization of the vertebrate nervous system. The central nervous system is formed from the hollow dorsal nerve cord, or the notochord, present in all chordates. The cavity of the notochord develops into the spinal cord's central canal and the brain's ventricles, both of which fill with cerebrospinal fluid that is produced by the brain by filtering blood from arteries. And the cerebrospinal fluid serves to nourish the brain, transport hormones, and carry away wastes from the brain by draining into veins. The spinal cord runs lengthwise within the spine. It delivers information to and from the brain. It facilitates locomotion and facilitates reflexes. Reflexes are involuntary actions that are performed automatically by the spinal cord independently of the brain. Therefore, reflexes can act as a rapid form of protection against potentially hazardous stimuli by producing very fast responses without the need for information processing within the brain. The peripheral nervous system contains afferent neurons that carry information towards the central nervous system and efferent neurons that carry information away from the central nervous system and towards other parts of the body. It has two efferent components. The motor system. The motor system is an efferent component of the peripheral nervous system that facilitates the delivery of signals from the central nervous system to the skeletal muscles to facilitate locomotion that can either be voluntary or involuntary. The autonomic nervous system is an efferent component of the peripheral nervous system that carries signals from the central nervous system to the smooth muscles and cardiac muscles to regulate their involuntary contractions. Additionally, the autonomic nervous system can be split into three divisions known as the parasympathetic, the sympathetic, and the enteric divisions of the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system serve antagonistic functions typically. The sympathetic division is associated with arousal and the flight or fight response, and the parasympathetic division is associated with calming, rest, and digest functions. Homeostasis often relies on the coordination between the motor system and the autonomic nervous system. And finally, let's talk about glia real quick. Glia are cells found within the nervous systems of vertebrates and invertebrates, including the peripheral nervous system's Schwann cells and the central nervous system's oligodendrocytes. They complement neurons by supporting them, nourishing them, and augmenting their functions. And here I have a diagram depicting the nervous system in a human. The central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system consists of the cranial nerves, the ganglia outside the central nervous system, and the spinal nerves. Let's move on and talk about the vertebrate brain. We can discuss arousal and sleep. The brainstem and the cerebrum control the states of arousal and sleep. The brain is active during sleep, and its activity varies throughout the different stages of sleep and can be measured using an electroencephalogram or an EEG. Despite Sleep's vital importance to survival, very little is known about its functions. However, evidence suggests that it is involved in the integration of learning and memory. The biological clock and a network of neurons in the midbrain and pons, known as the reticular formation, each have a hand in regulating sleep. Let's focus on biological clock regulation for a moment. Nearly all living creatures have a sort of internal biological clock that acts as a timer for processes that occur in time-based intervals. For example, circadian rhythms are some such intervals that last around 24 hours and are regulated by a bundle of light-sensitive neurons located in the hypothalamus that are collectively known as the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And finally, for this slide, we'll touch on emotions. Emotions are generated and processed within the limbic system of the brain, which encompasses structures such as the amygdala, the hippocampus, and regions of the thalamus. The amygdala, which is located near the cerebrum, is a structure of the limbic system of the vertebrate brain and plays an important role in the storage and recollection of emotional memories. And the generation and experience of emotion typically relies on the interactions of multiple parts of the brain. Next, we'll talk about functions of the cerebral cortex, starting with information processing. The cerebral cortex of humans receives sensory input from clusters of sensory receptors found within sensory organs, and from the somatosensory receptors that are distributed throughout the body, both internally and externally. Incoming sensory information is usually directed to sensory areas within the brain by the thalamus, and from the dedicated sensory regions of the brain, sensory information is then routed to association areas of the brain that process specific characteristics of the information. From there, sensory information travels to the prefrontal cortex, where responses to stimuli are planned. And the cerebral cortex may then generate motor commands that consist of action potentials produced by neurons within the motor cortex at the rear of the frontal lobe. The action potentials travel to the brainstem and spinal cord via axons, where they stimulate motor neurons, which stimulate skeletal muscle cells and cause movement. Neurons of the somatosensory and motor cortexes are arranged based on which regions of the body they receive sensory input from or send motor commands to. For example, the neurons that receive sensory information from the legs and feet are positioned near the midline of the somatosensory cortex, and neurons that send motor commands to the legs and feet are positioned near the midline of the motor cortex. This brings me to this diagram that depicts the primary motor cortex in orange and the primary somatosensory cortex in blue. I also chose this image just because, it's kind of horrific to look at. I found it somewhat amusing. But you can see this shows which regions of the brain control which areas of the body. So we start with the tongue, jaw, lips, face, eye, brow, and so on. Just found that interesting. Moving on to language and speech. Pierre Broca discovered that defects in a small area of the left frontal lobe, which is now referred to as Broca's area, affect one's ability to speak. And Carl Wernicke discovered that defects in an area of the posterior region of the left temporal lobe, which is now referred to as Wernicke's area, they affect one's ability to comprehend speech. Which brings me to my next point. Lateralization of cortical function. Lateralization refers to the specialized functionality of each hemisphere of the cerebrum. For example, the left hemisphere is more suited to performing mathematics, logical operations, and understanding language. Now, the right hemisphere is more adept at pattern recognition, face recognition, identifying spatial relationships, and nonverbal thinking. And a fibrous structure known as corpus callosum facilitates communication between the two hemispheres of the cerebrum. Let's talk about memory and learning very briefly. We'll start with neuronal plasticity, which is also known as neuroplasticity, and refers to the central nervous system's ability to modify, erase, and create new neuronal connections, usually at synapses, in response to its own activity to more effectively shape circuits that share information in useful ways. A defect in neuronal plasticity, specifically a disruption of the modification of synapses, may be an underlying cause of autism spectrum disorder. And moving on to memory and learning. New information is retained in the mechanisms of short-term memory, and then it is either forgotten or memorized through the mechanisms of long-term memory, where it will remain until we recall it from long-term memory and draw it back into the short-term memory. Both kinds of memory rely on the information storage that takes place within the cerebral cortex, and temporary links within the hippocampus retain short-term memory information, and when things are memorized for the long term, these temporary connections are replaced by connections located directly within the cerebral cortex. This consolidation is thought to occur during sleep, and activities of the hippocampus are thought to form the basis of some dreams. Injury to the hippocampus can leave long-term memories formed prior to the injury intact while inhibiting the formation of new long-term memories. I have this diagram depicting neuronal plasticity and how synaptic connections can change over time, strengthening or weakening in response to the level of activity at the synapse. So here, a high level of activity at the synapse of neuron 1 with the postsynaptic neuron leads to recruitment of additional axon terminals from that neuron, as you can see here. And a lack of activity at the synapse with neuron 2 leads to a loss of functional connections with that neuron. As you can see, this one is now severed. And if two synapses on a postsynaptic cell are often active at the same time, the strength of both responses may increase. And finally, that brings us to nervous system disorders. Starting off with schizophrenia, from the Greek schizo meaning split and phren meaning mind, is a nervous system disorder that can be passed down through genetics and results in the patient having psychotic episodes during which they commonly experience hallucinations, delusions, and a generally fractured perception of reality. Furthermore, it has been hypothesized that patients who experience schizophrenia suffer from a disruption in neuronal pathways that involve dopamine, and that there may be a connection between schizophrenia and the complement protein C4 that is present within the body's immune system. Depression is a nervous system disorder that can cause patients to experience time periods marked by depressed moods, abnormal sleeping behavior, changes in appetite, and low energy levels. Additionally, depressive disorder can be split into two major forms: major depressive disorder, characterized by long periods of depressive disorder symptoms, a lack of pleasure from or interest in previously enjoyed activities, and bipolar disorder, which is characterized by radical shifts between a manic phase and a depressive phase. Next, we'll move on to the brain's reward system and drug addiction. In the vertebrate brain, a neuronal circuit known as the reward system responds to inputs delivered to neurons in the ventral tegmental area with the release of dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter that causes feelings of pleasure and serves to motivate the vertebrate to perform tasks that are essential for survival or reproduction, like eating when hungry, drinking when thirsty, sexual activity when aroused. And long-term drug addiction can have significant long-term effects on the circuitry of the reward system that cause a persisting craving for the drug that is independent of any pleasure derived from consumption. Next, we'll talk about Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is a nervous system disorder that accounts for more than half of dementia cases and is the sixth most common cause of death among adults in the United States. Furthermore, postmortem examinations of the brains of victims of Alzheimer's disease have shown that Alzheimer's has two hallmark features: neurofibrillary tangles comprised of the tau protein and amyloid plaques that are comprised of clumps of beta amyloid that accumulate outside of neurons and seemingly trigger the deaths of surrounding neurons. This figure here is the microscopic signs of Alzheimer's disease, and here you can see the amyloid plaque and the neurofibrillary tangle. And finally, we'll talk about Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease can be treated currently but not cured. It is a nervous system disorder that affects the motor functions and can cause muscle tremors, tightening of facial muscles, and poor balance, among other symptoms. It's progressive like Alzheimer's. It typically gets worse as time goes on. And furthermore, Parkinson's disease is related to the death of neurons that typically secrete dopamine at synapses in the basal nuclei of the midbrain. And that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for listening, and have a great day.